All right, I am going to get started. We're here at the hour. Good morning, unless you're on the East Coast or further east, and then it's afternoon, I guess. Wow. Anyway, good whatever time of day it is to you. And today I'm going to be doing a webinar on an interesting topic, intent mapping, and I'll get into a lot more detail about what that means. But this is something I've been working on a lot lately. And essentially, the headline here is like how to decide if you're doing prompt monitoring, like LLM visibility, how to decide what prompts to monitor to see what you're visible in. So I'm going to talk about that in a lot of detail. First and foremost, I like to always give Lindsay a note of thanks here for organizing this. So she does growth for us, and that involves wearing a lot of hats. So she's doing like the campaigns, the graphics, all the logistics and coordination of these. I just make slides and show up and present, which is really great for me. So thank you, Lindsay. And speaking of me, I'm Erik. I'm the CEO of Hit Subscribe, and also do generally most of our R&D. And I've had kind of an interesting and eclectic career, a bunch of years in software engineering to get some technical seasoning, and then management consulting in that same space where I learned to help organizations make a lot of data-driven decisions. And now it's digital marketing with content and search visibility. So I can bring those first two disciplines along for the ride and hopefully create some interesting content. I also like to talk before we get started about why it's worth listening to us on this, perhaps just, so you're not wasting your time. So we have a lot of years of experience of driving traffic through traditional like SEO, organic search. We've also had this front row seat to the evolving practice, if you will, of GEO, but I like to think of this as kind of search diversification because I'll get into this more. I think of these as all kind of similar and intertwined Q&A. So I think of it as search visibility. And then recently we've been doing a pretty deep dive into um, the particulars of this intent mapping concept. So in terms of what you can expect here, by the end of this webinar, you'll have a plan if you are interested to assess the effectiveness of your landing pages for their contributions to your search visibility. So, we've got our solutions page up. Is it helping us? You'll have a playbook here for refining your landing pages according to what you find. Um, and you'll be able to know which LLM prompts you should start out monitoring in order to understand how you're doing. And then finally, deploying, you'll have some tactics to deploy to improve your standings in those prompts and perhaps some other prompts. And towards that end, very briefly, I'm going to talk about kind of the problem here of like tracking decisions around prompts. I'm going to go into just a little bit of search theory here to seed the conversation. And then we'll talk about like the problem of deciding which prompts to own, how intent mapping solves that problem, and then what to do with the intent map that is getting produced. We'll have a little bit of information on closing visibility gaps, so kind of AEO tactics, if you will. And then I want to close out with how you can do this yourself if you're not using Rosetta and you don't have the tooling that we built for this, just to make sure that you're kind of wrapping up with something concrete to take away. And then in the wrap, we can do a Rosetta run on your behalf, or, we can give you some assets to help you do it. So first of all, the problem of deciding what prompts to track. This is a conversation that's come up a lot over the last year. So what I've got here is a screenshot of our Osiris offering on our public demo site. And we track LLM queries. We have for quite a while, I think over a year. And when this comes up, when we show this to clients, like, hey, we can track any prompts you want, see how often you're mentioned in there. The client may lead with something like, we need to show up more. Okay, well, what prompts? Well, I don't know. What do you think we should track? And that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask us. And then we'll, volley back with, well, I don't know. What do you want to have said about you? And so it kind of goes back and forth in this ocean boiling exercise that doesn't always feel super productive. So that conversation gave rise to the tactics that we've been deploying here of late and this whole intent mapping concept. When it comes to tracking visibility in LLMs, there are kind of two core approaches here that I tend to see. The first one is large scale prompt tracking. So this is like what Ahrefs is doing here, where they're like, you have a 12 out of 100 on AI or whatever. And I don't mean to, sound snarky about it, but like it's kind of interesting, but it's not super actionable because they're just, across a huge data set, they're tracking how often you come up. And for my way of thinking, I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with that information since it's really just heavily correlated with how big of a brand presence you have in the first place. So if you build your brand, to epic proportions, then you're going to show up more, and hey, that's great, but it's not the most actionable thing in the world. And then there's what we're doing here, and the hyper specific tracking, where it's like, okay, let's just pick out some prompts and we'll track how you show up in that. That is probably quite actionable, but it's kind of limited by your skill in the moment for divining like what are representative prompts to track, and that it also faces its own challenges. So rolling up the difficulties that we're facing in this conversation about what to track. Number one, so historically with SEO, keywords are pretty straightforward and they're finite. So if you have like one, two, three words going into a phrase and the phrases are coherent, there is kind of a finite amount of those relevant to your domain to even think about tracking in the first place. So we can't really mimic that in prompts because from like combinatorics perspective, there are more prompts you could track than atoms in the universe. So it quickly explodes the longer the set of text that you are talking about here. So you can't just say, well, let's approach it the way we did with SEO. The visibility thing again is interesting, but it's not really something that's going to be super actionable. Knowing what to track here is just very much harder than it's ever been, given the nature of prompts versus SEO. So where this came up, the intent mapping approach is a kind of hybrid here that stops the ocean boiling. Loosely speaking, it works like this. We're going to examine the landing pages on your site, and we're going to reason that if you cared enough about a topic to create a landing page about it, this is commercially indicative of how you want to be known. So we're going to take a look at the landing pages on your site, and we're going to see what questions they answer. And what I mean by that is essentially what question would somebody be asking when your landing page is the answer to that question. So I'm going to thread in an example throughout the presentation using HubSpot as a publicly available thing that everybody knows about. So for instance, the page that I was looking at for HubSpot, the question somebody might be asking is like, what's a good CRM for a small business? HubSpot would like to probably show up in queries of that nature, and their landing page purports to answer that question. So based on that idea, we're going to start to understand the nature of the questions for which you are the answer. And then we're going to start to track those and see how visible you are, perhaps compared to others or just in your own right, and then act on those findings. If we're finding they're not very visible, even though you have a landing page, why might that be? What could we do to improve it? We're going to also avoid tracking things that you haven't attempted to show up for. So you may want to show up for all manner of things, but if you haven't created any content to that effect, it's going to be pretty noisy to track that since you don't have a reasonable expectation to show up for it. And in this fashion, we'll avoid irrelevant and non-actionable data through ocean boiling and through tracking the wrong things. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on, let's call it some search visibility theory. So SEO, GEO, Q&A, like Reddit, Quora, whatever. All of these things, in a manner of speaking, are Q&A. So search is search. In all of these cases, people have questions, and you are trying to create content in various media and various ways to answer their questions. That is the through line here. And this is important to understand as you think about the relationship between keywords and prompts. So I have this example here where let's take the, sort of classic conundrum of where can I get some good Chinese food? So anybody that's been in SEO for a long time will recognize this format. We still have the question, the core question, where can I get some Chinese food? But for whatever reason, 20 years of search history, people like to Tarzan the search engine. So where can I get some Chinese food becomes best Chinese near me. And so you're reducing the question, but it's still a core question. If you were to ask this question on a local Facebook group, the context of where is implied in the group. So you might just write into Facebook group local best Chinese food go and wait for the comments. If you're doing this in Quora or Reddit, where it's maybe not location specific, then you would specify your location and a radius that you're willing to look in. This is context. And apparently I'm willing to drive really far for Chinese food tonight. With LLMs, something interesting has happened, which is that we really like to dump our buckets with a lot of context to LLMs. I kind of think this might be because of 20 years of being starved for context in traditional search. So here it's, hey, robot friend, I'm pretty hungry, and so on and so forth, and blah, blah, blah. And where should I go get Chinese food? But the important thing to recognize is that the core question here is always the same. It's just we're expressing it in different ways. And because of that, we can draw some interesting relationships among traditional search and among LLM search and maybe even other media that may come up over the course of time. So some insights for you here to take away from this and to be aware of as we go forward in the presentation. First and foremost, answer engines are search engines with better reading comprehension. A lot of times they are not trained on something like what is the best Chinese food in Anthem, Arizona. That's too fluid. So what they're going to actually do is just turn around and turn your question into a Google search or a Bing search that they execute. They retrieve the results, synthesize them, and present them to you. So the answer engines are doing this exact exercise that I'm talking about, which is mapping longer form questions to shorter form searches. So because of this, a unified search strategy in general, the unit here, if you will, is a question, and you're just mapping that question into the different media where it might be asked. And because of this, keywords actually make a great starting point for any kind of research you're going to do in any medium. And the reason for that is they are the most compact in nature and kind of easy to work with and track in a database or something like that. And then you take the keyword and you extrapolate to prompts and to context from a keyword. And that can give you an idea of if you have a landing page that's traditionally optimized for a keyword, what sort of prompts it might be expected to show up for. And then a last thing to understand here is that when you create a page on your site, it should really answer a core foundational question, one core foundational question, and then let's call it a subset of follow-up questions. So in the HubSpot example, like what is the best CRM for small businesses? That is the core focused question that it is answering as a landing page. It might then answer follow-up questions in the SEO world. This would be called like keywords and child keywords or synonym keywords. You might have a question that's like, what's the pricing of this best CRM for small business, or until up to what size are we considering this to be a small business? So you may well answer essentially follow-up questions to the core question, but you should really have one URL, one page, one main question that you're addressing. So thinking about which prompts you should own, just in general, what this looks like to reason about. I've touched on this a little already, but one of the things you could do is say, okay, let's think about what somebody might say to ChatGPT or Claude or whoever, where we would want to show up. I guess it's not the worst thing to do, but that's going to really be an ocean boiling exercise. It's probably going to be frustrating and time consuming and not super accurate. So the next thing you might say is let's turn historically, maybe we have a list of core keywords from an SEO firm that we engaged or something like that. Why don't we map those out into prompts? I like that approach a little bit better, but what I would suggest here is the approach that we've landed on with our intent mapping, which is to first reason that if you want to really understand your priorities, putting your money where your mouth is, if you have created a landing page about it, you care about it. Let's start there. So what we're going to do is map landing pages to prompts to get a working set of prompts that you want to track and have a starting point that is grounded in reality. Now, as you do this, and setting aside intent mapping for the moment, there may be some other prompts that you would want to reasonably work into your core set of prompts. So let's say you do this exercise of intent mapping, you map your core landing pages to some prompts, and then you're saying, yeah, this is good, start, but there's some other things we want to show up for. So you could supplement that list potentially with prompts mapped from core keywords, like I was just talking about. You could also include in that list any draft or aspirational landing pages. So if you've created 5 of the 10 solutions pages that you eventually are going to have, it may well be reasonable to include those additional 5 that are not yet published. You could also map, if you've done some kind of keyword gap analysis, the Ahrefs, I forget what that tool is called, but where you see what keywords your competitors are showing up for, but you're not. You could also map those keywords to prompts and try to track for those. But number one, I would really only do the aspirational ones if you're truly going to publish those pages. If it's a someday maybe thing, then you're just going to track stuff that isn't worth tracking. But personally, and to speak to the intent mapping exercise, I would start with the core landing pages and get it working end to end, get those prompts up and tracking, and then tune from there, rather than start out with a gigantic list of varying degrees of relevance. One last thing to understand here before I go through the intent mapping process, prompts expose page intent versus reality. And I'll get into this a little bit more as we go, but when you do this exercise, and you land on some prompts. There are a couple of challenges here in your actual realized set of prompts versus what you might want to be tracking or you might be thinking about. Number one is the aspirational page situation here, where you've brainstormed some prompts and you don't yet have any content that addresses those prompts. This is definitely a challenge because it's going to pollute the data set. The other thing that I'll get into in a little bit more detail is you might have content about it, but it may be structured in such a way that it doesn't actually address the prompt that you're meaning for it to address. And this can be, if you think back to the world of SEO, this would essentially be you've created a landing page, but you have no idea how to optimize for SEO. It's a similar kind of thing. Like it's a Q&A structure in nature. And if you have gone and written up a landing page that isn't really answering any questions, it's not going to help you as much as you might want in search. And intent mapping as an exercise is a great way to baseline and to identify those situations where maybe you're not doing quite what you want to be doing. So let's look at intent mapping. This is essentially the next set of slides is going to be what we're doing with the Rosetta tool that I'm using to do intent mapping. So how we do this in depth and what it looks like. So Rosetta is the nickname that I've given the IP that I've been creating here over the last month or two. And Rosetta is an agentic workflow that shares context between API, Claude API, and Claude Chat. To my chagrin, I can't just share that context behind the scenes, so I have to explicitly share it. This is called Rosetta for reasons you'll see a little bit more detail here shortly, but I named it this because it's mapping landing page to keyword to question to prompt. So I thought of this as kind of like the Rosetta Stone of search, and I've called her Rosetta. And I'm going to walk through how Rosetta works, how we do this, and what the methodology is. But one thing to bear in mind that I'll talk through at the end is you can do this without any of our IP on your own. It may be a little rougher in some cases, but there is absolutely nothing here that you're not capable of doing for yourself. So, to overview the process, just how this works at a high level so that you understand the 10,000-foot view as I go into detail. The first thing we do is identify the commercial pages on a site, the target site for the intent mapping, usually our clients for us, but we could do it on any site. So you would identify those commercial pages, and then what we're going to do is we're going to capture and store important content information about those pages, not the whole of the content itself for reasons I'll explain briefly, but when I say important information, I'm talking about the title of the page, the SEO, the meta title, the description, and the H2s on the page. So we're kind of looking at the page in the way that a crawler might look at the page in brief. So we're going to store all of that information, and then we're going to feed the URL and content information into Rosetta and essentially ask her the question, what question does it seem like this page is designed to answer? And then we want you to express that in keyword form, in question form, and then in LLM prompt form. So we're going to get that information back from her, and she is going to say, for this URL, here are some keywords that you might well be targeting. Here are some prompts that you might be trying to show up in. So we're going to take all of that information, and then for our clients, we're going to feed that right back into our Osiris install, and we are going to track that information. So here's what you are trying to rank for with your landing pages in search, traditional search, in LLM search. How are you actually doing over the course of time? So that is the core intent mapping process. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges to doing it manually, because that answers the question, like, why on earth would you go to all the trouble of building this? So first and foremost, documenting all the URLs on a site that are commercial in nature can be sort of time consuming depending on how the site is structured. The enrichment piece, so gathering the content information, can be fiddly and noisy depending on your site. I'll explain a little bit more there, but basically not all sites are the same. You can't always go and find that information in the same places and in the same ways. It would be a lot easier to do this on one site than it is for us to be able to do it at scale. Tuning the prompt, so like actually giving Rosetta the context that she has, it was something I iterated towards over the course of time, and it's going to be a lot easier if you can look at the results and have a lot of experience in your head of mapping keywords and questions to landing pages and say, no, you're not getting that right, and here's why. I'm going to tune you a little bit. And the last part is differentiating pages that aren't really relevant for search. So again, that experience comes in. There may be some landing pages, like say you're defining a category and it's a product page. a page like that probably isn't really even meant to show up in search. It's more just meant to explain yourself, and nobody knows to search for the category you're defining. So it is important at times to say like, hey, this isn't a coherent mapping here, and that's okay because that's not really the point of this page. So with that in mind, this is what it looks like in a little bit more detail. Identifying commercial pages on your site. The best holistic way to do this might be here's in HubSpot, you go and you just examine the menu. So this is like by use case. You can go look at these URLs and categorize them, make note of them as you go. So one way to do this would be to look at your sitemap. And from inventorying a lot of sites over the course of time, this is common. So a lot of times you can simply identify the page type because it bakes the page type right into the URL, depending on the CMS and how you've structured it. So this is a good way to do it. You can also just navigate your site by hand and categorize the pages. You can consult your CMS. So walking through WordPress, for instance, under pages would be a handy way to do this. And you could crawl the site menu. This is actually what we do. So I'm going to get to this in the next slide. But in any way that you're going to approach this, what you are looking to do is build out a list of the commercial pages on your site and secondarily categorize them. This is a solutions page. This is a product page. This is a use cases page, etc. So what we're doing here, I actually gave an example of doing this live for HubSpot. I'm feeding this to Claude. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on HubSpot's homepage and say view source. I'm going to copy all that HTML and send it into Claude. And I'm going to tell it that I want back a list of the URLs and the category of those URLs given its menu structure. So I'm essentially asking Claude to define the menu structure of that site given the raw HTML of the homepage. This works the majority of the time, depending on the page and the theme and the implementation itself. You can be specific with Claude and tell it not to make things up. Actually, that's important because they will hallucinate and just make things up. So, if it's not clear, raise that to me. And the idea here generally is just that it's a nice shortcut to getting this list. But when you get it, you're going to want to do at least some spot checking of the URLs to make sure it hasn't given you some nonsense. So if it gives you something that's clean, this can be a good way to shortcut the process I mentioned in the last slide. And this is what I start with when I do this. Also, not for nothing, I'll probably to some degree automate this with probability at some point. I just haven't done that yet. So once you have that list of URLs, we're going to engage a process called enriching the URLs. And this is what I mean about gathering core information. So this is the core of an enrichment. We're going to feed the URL. And for us, this is a Python script. It's not LLM stuff. It's just go out and scrape the site. We're going to grab meta title and description, H1 and H2 is in an intro paragraph, because overwhelmingly this stuff can easily be scraped from a site and it's fairly universal. This doesn't vary a ton from site to site. Now, you might think, why not just go get all of the content? And that is something you could try to do, especially if you're only doing this on your site. But you really get into some murky territory here because you've got content in the footer, content in the sidebar, content in the header. So it can actually be pretty hard to differentiate like what is the actual core content of the page versus what is just noise from other widgets on the site. The other thing I'll say here is it may be better not to over pollute with data. This is really going to be the core set of stuff that like crawlers are going to look at. They're going to overly weight this information. And so I personally like to use that for this exercise. We're essentially presenting the page to Rosetta for analysis in the way that crawlers are kind of looking at your content to begin with for search. So once we have that done, once we have gathered this list of URLs and then also paired that with data about the content, we are going to ask Rosetta to do some analysis. For us, we are storing enriched URLs in BigQuery as part of our Osiris. So all we're doing is hitting our BigQuery instance with a Python script. We're extracting data and we're feeding it to Rosetta. And feeding it into, we're using JSON to do this. You want to give it in a very structured format to an LLM if you're going to ask for this kind of analysis. So we take the data out, we put it into JSON, and we send it to Claude API. The other thing that we're going to do here, just a pro tip, you want to batch this as much as possible. So you're not saying to the LLM, we're not saying to Rosetta, Here is a URL and the data about it, give me back a map. Here's the second one, give me back a map. If you do that, you're going to blast through tokens because the context there is expensive. So it's here is your context. Here's 50 URLs and all the data. Give me back 50 URLs and all the data. So that is kind of the core process. This is going to give us back a content map or an intent map. Um, in a meta sense, we're going to occasionally tune and refine the prompt as needed. This was needed a lot in the early going. These days, relatively rare. She's generally giving me back something I like. Um, and then once we have this, so this is what the data looks like. I'll go into that here in a sec. But once we have this information for us, we are putting the keywords that she comes up with and the prompts that she comes up with back into Osiris, and we're starting to track those for the clients. Now, this is what actually the output from Rosetta looks like. So we have fed in a URL and some content information. She turns this into a URL. Here is the primary question that we think somebody is asking when this URL would be relevant, when this page would be relevant. Here is the target keyword I'm going to distill this question down to. Here are some LLM queries that I'm going to expand it out to with context based on the page. And then finally, some meta information. So I've asked her to express how confident she is in her analysis. And I've also asked her to express her reasoning. If you're going to ever self-serve on this, asking for the reasoning is super valuable because that lets you correct her. So, for instance, if I really didn't like this particular analysis, I might say, given that she's saying I did this because the H1 and the intro copy both, blah, 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 I might say, okay, that's not enough data points. It should be the H1, the intro copy, and a third data point, for instance. So you can see if you disagree with her reasoning exactly where you disagree. These become less important at scale, but it's really good for tuning the model. So at the end, just to kind of recap what you've got here, this question is Rosetta's opinion on what is something that somebody would be asking when they are ideally suited to be landing on this page, or essentially like, what question do I think this page is answering? And so the rest of the information is what keyword would somebody be searching when they should wind up on this page? What LLM query would somebody be asking when this page is worth being cited and is relevant? And so by doing that in this fashion, we can come up with a pretty grounded list in reality about what is worth tracking. So let me pause here for a break. And Lindsay, I'm not sure how we're gathering any questions folks might have, but do you have any questions so far? I'm going to take a sip of coffee.
No, no questions have come through yet.
Okay, well, easy enough. So that is the intent mapping as we do it and explained in depth. Now, the next thing I'm going to go into here is, okay, so you've got this list of keywords and this list of prompts for a particular landing page. What do you do with that? Now, keywords and prompts, we're going to have kind of two different playbooks. The one on the left, traditional SEO, for any of you that are experienced in this is fairly straightforward, kind of by the book stuff. What we're going to do with that is track the ranking of those keywords for those landing pages. So essentially, like how visible are they in search versus how visible would we expect them to be? If they're lagging, we might try running experiments and tuning the URLs to bolster their search position. Um, we might do gap analysis against competitor pages or sites to see, who's beating us and why, or who, what are they showing up for that we're not. And then we're going to create URLs to address those gaps and create content for topical authority, meaning if you're trying to show up for best CRM for small business, one of the reasons you might not be showing up with a landing page is if that's literally the only time on your site you've ever talked about that topic, you would want more topical authority. You would want to weigh in on that topic more frequently so that the crawlers built a knowledge graph that you are authoritative on the topic. So that's all pretty textbook SEO stuff. Now, the interesting thing is there are differences here in what you want to do for answer engines, but more at the margins and less from a holistic methodology perspective. So one key difference here comes down to tracking. SEO is fairly straightforward. You've got like Google Search Console and Bing Webmaster Tools that are saying, here are how many people I've shown your page to, and here's how many of them clicked. Like you have a really rich set of data to evaluate how you're doing. With LLMs, there's really nothing like that from answer engines. So instead, you're looking at things like, I mean, sure, referral from a citation to your landing page, if you can attribute the content to like ChatGPT doing a referral, that's great. But this is more likely to show up as increased brand and referral traffic. So it may be also direct. What I'm getting at is somebody asked ChatGPT what the best CRM for small business. Maybe they click on a HubSpot link right out of ChatGPT, but they also might see HubSpot as an answer and type HubSpot into Google, or they might navigate to HubSpot.com. It's hard to say. So the tracking is a little bit fuzzier here. You're going to measure visibility in LLMs, which is straightforward, but the actual traffic impact on your site is murkier. Now, the kind of tune URLs accordingly is going to follow a slightly different playbook at the more tactical level, but by and large, it's the same concept. So you have mapped out what queries you would like to show up for in answer engines. And if you're showing up, great. If not, you're going to do similar things, trying to tune your pages to make it more likely that you will show up. That is really no different, even if it is different at the tactical level. Similarly, you're going to do a different sort of gap analysis, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You're going to do a slightly different kind of gap analysis against competitors, but still doing that gap analysis is worthwhile so you can understand what you might need to do to close the gap. And then based on that, creating URLs is worth doing, and so is building topical authority. So different playbooks, but not what's the word I'm looking for here? Not like massively different. So without dwelling on this too much, for traditional SEO, the keywords come out of Rosetta, and you're going to put the keywords. I mean, this is how it looks in Osiris. You're going to put the keyword in there, pair it with the URL. We're going to project where you would rank, measure where you're actually ranking, and then keep track of how you're doing so we can make modifications to the URLs as needed. Pretty straightforward. The prompt list, on the other hand, there's going to be a step that I want to go through in this whenever we're doing this with a client. We want to validate the prompts and the landing pages and the pairing here in a way. And let me explain what I'm getting at with that. So first question, do the Rosetta prompts even make sense? You can, with a sufficiently garbled landing page, get Rosetta to spit out some real garble. The next thing is, would an actual person ever ask this question? And as an example, I've got this question that I invented over here, but I can picture this. I can picture some large brand or consulting firm with a page that essentially is vague enough in nature because their goal with their website is to, move sales along in the funnel, they're not really trying to like get a call to action close or whatever. So they might create a landing page that says something like, we use AI to generate like cutting edge solutions for hard to solve problems. You can picture a sort of like vague positioning statement like that on a landing page. If you run Osiris on a page like that, you're going to get a weird question like this that probably no human being would ever take to any kind of medium and ask. And so if one of these things is true, if the question is literal nonsense or the question is something you just can't picture anyone asking, then we've got some decisions to make about the landing page. Is the landing page expressing itself in the way that you want it to? And again, if you're defining a category, maybe. And then we would just want to omit that from prompt tracking. If, on the other hand, you do want to show up in search and she's spitting out garble or a question nobody would ever ask, now it's time to think about tuning the landing page. And you could adjust the copy, at least model that out with like H1s and H2s and the things that Rosetta would analyze and kind of tune it until she's giving back questions that look more like what you would want to show up for. And so this can be an exercise in modifying your landing pages. Now, let's say that you've answered these first two correctly or to your satisfaction. The next question you might want to ask is, does this context actually, so for before where it was saying what the person's goals were with the small business for HubSpot, is that who we're talking about? So in the HubSpot instance, like, what's the best CRM for small business? Well, if they're not trying to market to small businesses, that's not a great result. So you can also see if the context being supplied aligns with your buyer personas and your ICP. And actually, we could even layer this into Rosetta and have her. I haven't done this yet, but it would be an interesting exercise to have Rosetta say, here's who I think this would speak to. And then finally, like, is this how you want to be known? So is HubSpot trying to be known as a CRM for small business? Then more macroscopically, this is where you could get into saying, all right, is anything missing from this core set of questions? That's going to, again, indicate that things are missing from your core set of landing pages. So what you're going to take all this information and you're going to adjust existing pages and maybe plan out future pages according to the analysis. So after validation, you're going to do like just what I touched on here, this internal analysis. This is really like, if we haven't covered everything, just forgetting competitors or anything like that, if we're missing some of our own value proposition, like what's missing, if Rosetta's not finding anything among your landing pages, you're not really and truly speaking to it. Early data that we're seeing suggests that probably the most valuable way to show up on a topic is to have topical authority, but having an actual landing page that says what you do and for whom is a serious signal of intent and probably a shortcut to showing up. So, one way that you could address this, so if you run Rosetta and you come up with this set of prompts, but it's only about 50% of what you think you want to be talking about or what you want to be known for, I would seed an LLM. So for me, I would just open up the Rosetta project and do this right in there. But I would gather up as much data as I could about positioning. So this is like internal docs on positioning, personas, customer feedback, anything you have from a marketing perspective that speaks to how you want to position yourself in the market. Give her all of that information, then give her the list of prompts and essentially say, what are we missing here? So she will spit out the delta and say, here is what you haven't covered with the pages on your site. And that can be a great exercise for saying, okay, let's feed this into a backlog of what solutions pages to create or whatever you're going to do. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about here is tracking over time, and then I'll talk a little bit about competitor gap analysis. But for us, before we're doing any tracking over time, or sorry, before we're doing any competitor gap analysis, we have to do a little bit of tracking because we need to look at the responses to the prompts to see who is being mentioned. So I'll come back to the competitor concept in a moment. But in terms of tracking how you're doing in LLM visibility, what you're going to want to do, or what we do, is we hit LLM APIs. So we're doing ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, and Gemini. We are sending all of the prompts out to those four answer engines, and we are getting responses back, and we're storing the whole response. And that lets us do, even retroactively, some interesting data analysis, like we can do mention analysis, sentiment analysis, kind of any other thing we dream up later and retroactively do it. Now, I'm guessing most people listening are not going to implement hitting APIs themselves. So as I'm mentioning here at the bottom, it's important to have tooling that does this for you. I'm not really an expert in what the best prompt tracking tools are given that we built our own. But you're going to want something to do this for you. It's not something I would probably self-serve on. But in general, you're going to want to gather up this representative set of prompts and you're going to want to get data on them, and not just one run, like ideally several runs, and kind of the more the better, because that's going to give you a pretty rich set of data about your visibility in the core set of prompts that matter to you. Now, over time, what you would be hoping for is that your mention rate is improving, and probably with some sentiment analysis in there, meaning you don't want your mention rate to be improving for don't use this brand for this thing. So there is some nuance in there, but generally you want a trend line that shows positive mention rate is improving over the course of time. That's what you're monitoring for, because your hypothesis is that your landing pages and your backing content for those landing pages are going to drive that result. So you do those things and then you monitor for the result that you expect. Now, once you've got some data in there, once you've been monitoring this a little bit, what we're doing with this is some competitor gap analysis. This is harder because there really isn't as much tooling, like Ahrefs and SEMrush and these tools have turned this into a fairly like commodity concern. But this is a little bit harder in this newer world. What we're doing when it comes to gap analysis, I mean, kind of anybody can show you like, mention rate in these tools, and here's Salesforce and here's you HubSpot, and you have some catching up to do, probably a little gamification of using their tool. That part isn't super hard, but what gets a little bit more interesting is what to do about it. So once you've got some tracking data in there, and once we have it, what we do is we take all of the prompts and all of the responses and we feed them into Rosetta. And then we also feed the sitemap of the target site into Rosetta. Now, the sitemap, what you can think of us as doing is feeding essentially the content of your site into Rosetta. It's not the full content of your site. That would be kind of impossible to do at scale, but it is those enriched URLs. We're feeding in the sitemap along with the URL enrichment. And what that does is give Rosetta a skeleton of the content on your site. So she understands the prompts that you're giving, the responses to those prompts, and the content on your site. So she has those three pieces of information as a baseline. Then, if we're doing a competitor analysis, we're going to ask her, okay, who's being mentioned more than our client HubSpot? Oh, we see that Salesforce is outpacing HubSpot. What we do with that information is we then take Salesforce's sitemap, we enrich their URLs and we feed that same information in. So she can then make an apples to apples comparison about what Salesforce is doing that HubSpot isn't to start coming up with some hypotheses as to why Salesforce would be more visible than HubSpot. And this is an absolutely excellent use case for LLMs. They're very good at pattern matching and statistical type of analysis. What comes out of this with the proper prompting about bearing in mind like topical authority and the knowledge graph, is she will spit out information that says something like, well, HubSpot has only talked about the topic of small business maybe 20 times, whereas Salesforce has talked about it 200 times. So there is a clear gap there. You should think about more content related to informational topics about small business. So this is a pretty, I guess, advanced thing in the scheme of things, but it becomes very possible after you have done some intent mapping. You can do a similar kind of concept and do an apples to apples comparison with various competitors. So I'm going to pause there and take another sip of my coffee. And any questions this time, Lindsay?
Nope, no questions came through.
Okie doke. I'm going to talk briefly here as we round out about closing visibility gaps. Now, this could be probably a webinar in and of itself because we're kind of talking about like AEO basically. But briefly, as it pertains to the intent mapping exercise, we've touched on this a lot here going through, but the first thing that I would be thinking about is building missing pages. So once you've done your exercise of, what prompts are we targeting, for lack of a better term, versus what prompts do we wish we were showing up for, that's going to lead to a list of pages that you should think about creating. Then these days, it's probably easier than it's ever been to spin up landing pages. I wholeheartedly endorse the approach of creating a good amount of landing pages. The next thing I'll suggest is you want to make absolutely sure your content is crawlable. One thing I've noticed analyzing how crawlers hit sites is the answer engine agents seem to look at the sitemap a lot more than traditional search agents, where they're both crawling and looking at the sitemap. So disproportionately, you're probably going to want to make sure that these landing pages appear in your sitemap. But in general, you want good hygiene around this to make sure that they're even being picked up. The next thing I would suggest is liberally using schema and structured data, especially the data that has no on-page searcher or reader experience. Now, I want to call something out here. This is not like the days of John Mueller or whoever sitting and kind of explaining, here's what you should do to rank in Google. There's nothing like that here. So the space is very, very speculative in terms of what tactics work and don't. But I like this tactic because it's a pretty rational way to assume that your site is being crawled and processed. And it's also really like low effort and low risk in terms of actually implementing it. So there's a decent possible upside, very little downside. So I would definitely err on the side of making the structure and the Q&A aspect of your page as intentional and as clear as possible. Um, Another thing that I think is more and more important these days, especially as you can create them quickly, is to create relevant comparison and category pages. So if you can bear to talk about your competitors, if I'm HubSpot, I might want a HubSpot versus Salesforce page. I also might want a best CRM for small businesses page. And the reason for that is LLMs are, as they go from rich conversations to relatively simplistic queries to supply information for search. They're doing a whole lot of best whatever searches and a whole lot of X versus Y searches to gain their data. So you want to be seen there and you want to have your opinion heard. Bonus points if you're able to get that information up onto other sites because then they're getting some verifying data from somewhere else. And then finally, you're still going to want to bolster topical authority because topical authority in the knowledge graph is relevant to all to both search and answer engines, but also given the infrastructural reliance on traditional search, where topical authority is very important, it is still going to be important here. So if you have created that best CRM for small business landing pages, you're going to want to talk a lot about CRMs and small businesses. And finally, tactically speaking, the thing to understand here is that this isn't just a one-off project. You don't maybe have to do quite the full boat like analysis constantly or whatever, but think of it this way. You're going to do this mapping exercise to understand your universe of prompts. You're going to validate the pages and the prompts and do that via analysis. Then you're going to build and tune and do stuff live on your site. You're going to track the impact of that, and then you're going to repeat it all because that is essentially the core of the scientific method and how I would approach. You're going to, hypothesize how you can improve, run the experiment, see what happens, learn, do it all again. And then finally, just to reiterate this point, as you're executing this loop for LLM visibility, it is important to remember, again, answer engines are using traditional search. So generally speaking, as you think about what you're doing, search visibility is going to be a leading indicator with this new concept of search. Meaning, if you want to show up in somebody's ChatGPT query about the best CRM for small business, a strong leading indicator that that's about to start happening is that you're on page one for a Google search of best CRM for small business. Now, I will close out with how you can do this yourself if you are interested, because again, I started this without the tools I eventually built, so it is possible. First up, if you want to identify your commercial pages, you can start with your main menu structure. This is where I like to start. But that doesn't always cover all of your pages. Now, if this is your site and you're in marketing on your site, you probably have access to this information in a variety of places. So maybe you have an internal list. You could consult your sitemap. That's a decent source of truth. You probably find some stuff in there you're surprised is still published. If most of the sites I look at are any indication, you could also consult your CMS. So you could go through an exercise where you look at all these things and you just go through building out a master list of your live landing pages. This isn't really the hardest thing to do. I would suggest, if you really want to be thorough, that you go through all of these sources of truth just to make sure that you're covering all your bases. If you're going to crawl the menu structure the way that I have, copy and paste your homepage structure into an LLM. It might be obscure, like the HubSpot one was huge and like ate up half my tokens for the 2 hour window. So you might need to do a little digging and iterate. You can actually look at a Claude or a ChatGPT and say like, okay, here's the HTML I've got. What do you think of this? Does this have the whole menu structure? What should I do? It will probably get this right in the end, but again, you want to verify it. If the reason I like crawling the homepage menu structure is you could almost weight these URLs more. If you are referring to a landing page from your homepage, you are sending a strong signal that that landing page is important to you. If I have to click through 4 submenus and pages and stuff to get to the landing page, the crawlers are well aware that this is not a super important page. So I like anchoring in this because it sort of force ranks the URLs in terms of how important you're signaling that they are. Enriching, this is going to be the hardest thing to do. It is going to be a little easier if you're focused on one site instead of doing it at scale. So this is an actual like screenshot of the Python script that I've got here. And what we're doing is crawling the site or scraping the site basically. And this wouldn't be a terribly hard thing to vibe code. We could even share some suggestions on how to prompt for vibe coding this. You would just show it your site and show it the HTML and say, our pages follow this format. Can you, create a Python script or whatever that is capable of scraping this and gathering this information? What you're going to want to grab is the meta title and description. This is trivial to find. H1s and H2s in an outline. Or that's going to be your outline. So the H1 and H2s of the page, not hard to find. And then the first or main paragraphs of the content. This might be a little trickier. But if you give all of this information, it shouldn't be too hard to vibe code up something that you can use on your site. I would also definitely store the output of this into a CSV. This allows you to view it as a spreadsheet if you want to go through it yourself, but the comma separated form is structural, so it's good to hand off to an LLM. It's nice structured data. Now, when it comes to the output that it gives back, getting that output and understanding it, this is the beginning of the system prompt that we're using across the context for Rosetta. You can help yourself to this. I'm not precious about it, so we can share that with you if you would like. But you could also write your own. So you need to prompt your helper here to understand SEO and particulars, and you want to explain what it is you're doing. Like we're trying to reverse engineer a keyword and LLM prompts based on this page. So you're going to do all that in prompting format. You're going to want to get the result back again in a CSV because you may either read and process it yourself in some fashion, copy it into other systems like an Airtable, so that'll be easy, or you're going to hand this to yet another instance of Rosetta or whatever it is you're using. And then finally, you're going to review the keywords, questions, and prompts to evaluate and tune your landing pages and also for tracking purposes. And speaking of tracking, if you want to track this, so we do this in Osiris. I am thus not really an expert in which tool. I'm not shopping around. What I've seen from Amplitude, this is a bit of a tepid recommendation, but I've gone there a few times. Amplitude built something that's free. You just put in your brand and it spits back a list of prompts that it thinks are relevant to you and where you stand in those. I like that it's free because they kind of poked a hole in the, I think, overvaluation of how expensive this should be. And it seems pretty solid from what I've seen. So if nowhere else, I would go take a look at Amplitude as a prompt tracking capability. I can't speak to the other tools. But however you track, I would recommend making sure that it is gathering data from multiple answer engines. I would recommend getting a good data size. So if you eventually settle on 30 or 40 prompts, you want to see them run a bunch of times, not just once to draw conclusions. And then ideally, I don't know if they tell you about this or not, but it would be good if they stored the entire response because that's going to allow them to do much richer data analysis. I mean, it'd be ideal if they store the entire response and actually give you that. But if they don't, if they're storing it themselves, they can at least do a richer set of analysis on it than if they're just storing like a true or false for whether you were mentioned. So that is it for the DIY section. And actually, all I've got left here is the wrap. So any questions here at this point, Lindsay?
Nope, you can go ahead and wrap up.
All right. So for the wrap up, next steps. So if you're interested, one of the things we're doing just to get more data and improve our craft on this as we go is we'll do this for you. So the richer the set of sites that we're doing this on, the more refined it's going to be. So if you're watching this and you are interested in getting a Rosetta output of your own site, all we really need from you is to know who you are and what the URL of your site is, and we'll turn that around in a day. So Lindsay put up a landing page for that, and you can fill that out. We'll get that in, and we will send you out a spreadsheet of the Rosetta intent mapping for you to take a look at. If you want to DIY, please let Lindsay know about that. And we can send you some prompt information. I don't have the prompt information like readily stored somewhere that I can just hand it off. So before going to the effort, I want to make sure that people are interested. But if you are interested, I have no qualms about sharing the prompts. That's fine. I can't really share our Python script, or I mean, I could, but it won't work for you because it's tied in with our BigQuery database. So you can't just take that and run it, but we can give you some information about how to prompt your robot helper in order to try to vibe code something up on your own. That's no problem to do. And generally, if there's enough interest, I don't really mind open sourcing the repos that we're building this stuff in. I haven't historically done that just out of habit, but there's nothing super proprietary in there. All our client data and information is stored in accessible places, so I'm not precious about the source code. And lastly speaking, I will mention that Rosetta is being developed under our Osiris offering as kind of tied in with that. It's a thing that we're doing for our clients. So if Hit Subscribe or Osiris is interesting to you more broadly, we have a page up on our site that you can take a look at. And we have a public demo of the Looker dashboard that interfaces with Osiris. It's a public site that we've created, and so we don't mind sharing the nuts and bolts of the underlying data. So you can actually look at what an Osiris dashboard would look like. And that is it for today. Hopefully, this is interesting. And if anybody, if you're still with me, I appreciate it. And if you have requests, like if some of the things that I mentioned about going into more detail about competitor gap analysis or on page on site AEO tactics, if any of that stuff sounds interesting, we're always open to ideas for future webinars. So thank you for watching. I will wrap there and catch you hopefully next time.